Okay, hello, and I want to thank you very much for inviting me to this TEDx talk. I am Emiliano Boccardi, and I'm doing a postdoc in philosophy here at Unicamp. And my research is about time, about the philosophy of time, and my main focus is on the passage of time. So we, in perception, and we seem to be acquainted with a lot of temporal properties, and we distinctly perceive things as changing. We ourselves change, or we think we do. We have different cognitive and emotional attitudes towards events that are past, present, and future. And for example, we fear or feel anxious about future negative events, but we don't feel anxious or we don't fear negative events which lie in our past. And as Lucretius once noticed, we fear death, that is our future non-existence, but we don't seem to fear the apparently symmetrical phenomenon of our prenatal past non-existence. Our language makes clear distinctions between past, present, and future events. We have tenses to do that. And we clearly intuit that time passes somehow. We say the time passes, the time flows, that we even say the time flies sometimes. But when we try to understand in exact details what all this amounts to, we find ourselves surrounded by great difficulties, and some of which appear to be insurmountable. And one of them has to do with the fact that, of course, time cannot be perceived directly, so anything that we happen to know about it must be indirect. We must infer properties of time and even its very existence indirectly. But perhaps the worst problems emerge when we realize that time appears to involve inconsistencies. And this happens when, for example, when we try to say exactly what the metaphor of passage amounts to. To say that time passes, that it flows, that it flies, of course, are all metaphors, but our rational understanding of reality and time in particular requires that we say exactly what this metaphor amounts to, what's its cash value, so to speak. And when we try to do that, we suddenly realize that it is very hard to explain in coherent ways what the passage of time amounts to. And in fact, many philosophers, starting from Parmenides in ancient Greece, but going through idealism, and up to now, many philosophers convince themselves that these difficulties are so great that we should abandon the idea that time passes and that temporal properties are real, and we should think of them as illusory somehow. And this trend became particularly fashionable, so to speak, after the introduction of the theory of special relativity by Albert Einstein in 1905. The theory of relativity appears to contradict the idea that time passes, essentially because it seems to have the consequence that simultaneity is relative to frames of reference. So we might not agree as to which events are present and which events are past. And if this is the case, then it seems to be very hard to explain in what sense time advances. So we tend to think that time passes in the sense that there is some feature which we call presentness, which advances relentlessly, and future times approaches and become present for a brief instant, and then they recede into the further and further past. Many scientists and analytic philosophers convince themselves that a passage in time are illusory, especially, as I said, after Einstein's theory of relativity. And so my research focuses on trying to understand how things may be otherwise. I belong to those philosophers who nonetheless think that time does pass, as it is intuitive to think it does, and of course I have to solve or try to solve all these problems which this idea faces. Those who think that time does not pass, of course, must explain why it seems to pass, and so they must explain this illusion. What I'm trying to do, on the other hand, is try to solve these problems, or at least indicate a direction in which we may go in trying to solve these problems.